I think we should maybe record an intro or something while we're here. I haven't even thought about it.
I think we should just call this podcast Humans in the Loop.
Oh, that's pretty good. I like it. You know what? I like it. Done. I think 90% of the LinkedIn posts I see nowadays are touching on this, but I haven't really seen anyone explicitly get to the heart of the matter, which is what does this actually mean now to be a human in the AI era? What is our actual value with the rise of the robots? And I think it's for real this time. We're actually realizing the value beyond rule-based automation. We've now surpassed it, and we're seeing notes that random automations or automation combinations are passing the Turing test. Things are happening at exponential growth. I, for one, but I want to hear your thoughts. I think there is still market value in being a human, especially in the context of what we're talking about, which is our little world that we always believe is the big world, but B2B SaaS sales. There's a role for the human, and I think it's evolving at light speed and it's ultra specific. And I think some people are going to get it and be wildly successful in this new paradigm. And some people are going to just bemoan it and say, a robot took my job and leave the industry. Uh, you tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you. I do think this is very real. I mean, having worked in the field now for the better part of, the last half a decade or more, I've certainly seen the progression of what we would look at as, old school kind of traditional robotic process automation, Python scripting,
Right.
all the way to slightly more advanced and AI, backed type of automation where you start applying, levels of agentic and LLMs and things along those lines to modify existing and old school, RPA technologies, becoming the new trend. And when you really start kind of peeling the layers of the onion to the level that we're at now, which is, getting to human interaction points, that's when things start to get really interesting. Because I think previously, and when I say previously, I mean even 6 months ago, I would say that the average person could probably very quickly identify the difference between, speaking with a bot and speaking with a real live human. And those lines are now rapidly blurring. And I think, to your point, the question is, how much do people prefer to speak to, potentially a very lifelike bot, whether it's chat, whether it's, text, whether it's, live on the phone, a video call. I mean, there's so many different ways that bots are now interacting with people on a conversational level. Is that truly the future? Or like you said, kind of, is there still a place for human emotion and human relationships, which I think both of us would agree the answer is yes. But, I think even that is going to change very rapidly here as the technology continues to improve, because I think you're going to find a large majority of the populace, right, is probably pretty willing to skip all the rigmarole, right, of dealing with a traditional, let's say SaaS-based sales model, right, where some, recent college grad has been hired as an SDR, he's banging phones, he's reading off a script, he doesn't really know what he's talking about, he doesn't really have any information about the product, he's not an industry expert, or she, right, I'm saying he, but it's universal, right, and a lot of folks, I think, quite frankly, don't want to talk to those people anymore, right? To a large degree. So I think there are real elements of, hey, a robot took my job, because if the right message comes across somebody's email or LinkedIn at the right time that applies to a real problem that they have, and it's coherent and it makes sense, and they respond back and they happen to be talking to a bot, but it's not immediately recognizable, and they can get some baseline information out of it relatively quickly, there's probably a real possibility that bots kind of ultimately assume that first half of sale. Now, where I think that starts to fall apart is when you enter into a real world sales cycle where now we need to start getting into the nitty gritty of, what is the desired outcome? What are the real world business problems that these people are facing? What level is this individual that we're engaged with? What is their, med pick? What's the immediate need? What's the problem? Who's my economic buyer, right? What's the impact? So on and so forth. I think that's where AI is going to start generally kind of falling short, and where relational, selling starts to reemerge as, okay, great. Maybe I've talked to a bot for the first 30% of this journey, but I'm not interested in, what Google's general mindset is.
I still have you.
I think that's when things are really going to shift. And that's why I think relational selling is going to be more important than ever, because as we start to get into the true meat and potatoes of these sorts of things, I don't think people want to buy from what's really and truly, when you at the base level, an LLM that's just looking at, market averages, for lack of a better term, of what's the right response and what's the application of this technology to this particular problem. And they're going to want to start understanding more of somebody who has a true understanding of this landscape's opinion on how to move forward here based on their very specific needs. And, I think you can never completely write off the fact that people still want to buy from people, in my opinion. If I don't like you, if I don't trust you, if I don't think you have my best interest in mind, if I
Yes.
don't think that you have a personal stake in this, then I'm not particularly interested in doing business with you. And I think that's a tried and true adage that's not going away anytime soon.
So let's break that down to the molecular and the most basic of definitives, which is that in a buying scenario where you have a seller and a buyer, we can safely presume that most of the time the buyer does not have a predisposition to an outcome. They're actually attempting to make a decision. If they knew exactly what they wanted to do, they would proceed directly to the finish line. So, what they are attempting to do in the course of interaction is level up their understanding or potentially retrieve some form of guidance from someone that they believe has more information or access to more information than they do. And I do very much agree with you. I still call that the uncanny valley. And there's a reason that that term was coined. It mainly came about, you know this, I'm sure, from video games where you had human-like avatars that were created. But there's this uncanny valley where they're almost identical to humans, but your brain can still tell. It's something about the reflections in the cornea. It's something we can tell. We know it's not a human we're interacting with. And even if we can't make that, even if we couldn't say it definitively, we know, number one. And then number two, we have a degree of discomfort culminating a process when we don't know the outcome with a robot. Now, if we know the outcome and we're just looking to fulfill, this is where I think one of those truisms that gets tossed around that says buyers have done the majority of the buying journey before they talk to a salesperson. I don't know if I really agree with that one, but that's a separate topic. But I think that we as humans want to buy from a fellow human. It's hardwired in our chemistry. We don't want to run a process completely with a robot. We do have a fundamental distrust there that says,
Yeah.
have you actually synthesized a solution for me? And do I trust that you're doing it? And a robot seems to not be able to overcome that barrier right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an interesting point. And I mean, it may even be as basic as, they know they have to award the business to someone. And I mean, again, this is tried and true dawn of
I
time.
like going with that.
I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of folks in those decision maker seats that are ultimately looking to award that business to somebody that they feel good about giving that business to. Because I mean, let's get rid of all the pretense, pretend like we're not two guys who have been in sales for a really long time. I mean, when we close a deal, we win. We get paid. That's the name of the game. That's what everybody's trying to do. We're all trying to make a buck. And the buyer certainly knows that as well. They're obviously trying to buy to solve for a problem that they have, and hopefully they gain some efficiencies and they free up some budget, or they hit a win, and that's a positive for their career. So I think, for me personally, if I'm sitting in the decision maker's seat, do I want to award the business to a bot? To an LLM, to a company that I don't really know anything about, to a company who I haven't built any
I
inroads to?
love that
I've
angle.
to a real person. I've never talked to a C-level executive at that organization. Their vision statement is probably also drafted by a large language model. We're seeing a lot of these things where a lot of these AI companies even are popping up and whatnot, and 90% of what they have to offer is probably also AI generated. And
Well, did you catch this one where a completely AI run company, meaning the CEO is actually an LLM, got funded? A
Sure.
VC as a moonshot just gave this company money and said, let's see what happens. It's wild.
It is, and I mean, granted, I take some of these things with a grain of salt because we're obviously
Sure.
in an AI bubble. As with
Of
any
course.
tech bubble, there's always going to be risk investors that are looking to find the next moonshot and get in early. Now,
Yeah.
now we've got companies that are essentially, the equivalent of a meme coin, and the name of the game is buy in as
Right.
early as humanly possible and get out before the rug pulls.
Yeah.
It's insane, right? And I think that's how this whole conversation and wanting to spin up these podcasts began, which is, dude, this is it. Like, this is really it. Like, the entire tech sector is being turned upside down, and people really are losing jobs to robots, and people really are buying from robots, and
Yes.
people really are creating companies with robots. I mean, my YouTube, I don't know about yours, but mine is chock full of nothing but dozens and dozens of new influencers, right, that are popping up on the daily, that are saying, hey, here is the guidebook, right? Here's the playbook to starting a company with less than 5 people, right, that can gain
Yeah.
over a
Oh yeah.
million dollars in value, right, in less than 3 months, while simultaneously, not writing a single line of code yourself, right?
Yep.
Utilizing tools like N8N, utilizing tools like
Yeah.
Bolt,
Clay.
Clay, like all of these types of new AI tools combined with AI marketing tools and AI automation built into, populating lists for your AI SDRs to reach out to. I mean, like, it's real. Like, it's, people can say that it's not real, but it
Oh,
definitely is.
it's
And I
real.
mean, I think understanding, like you said, going all the way back to the beginning, like, how do humans fit into, this world, which I don't think is just something that's going to disappear in 6 weeks from now or 6 months from now. We're only at the beginning. What does that really look like? And I think, specifically as it pertains to sales, am I wrong? Maybe it really does, trend into a world where at the end of the day, like, people just want the basic information. They don't want to be sold to, like, they just want to be able
I
to.
don't agree. We know what we don't know. And that's the thing. I think especially the more you sell up to an executive of a company, executives are more, almost ironically, hyper cognizant of where their expertise ends and
True.
where they need to seek assistance. By the time you get up to an exec level, you're an orchestrator more than an individual contributor. And
Sure.
part of what you're orchestrating is the ability to understand information that you may not have. So part of that, and the reason sales works as a profession, is being a font of information. But I think that information is rapidly evolving to an undercurrent that's always existed in our space. What is the undercurrent? And it became kind of a joke for a while when you have somebody tell you you're not selling enough value, and usually it's a product person, sorry, product people, you're not selling the value. What does that even mean? Well, I think that actually has started to mean something now because of the widespread access to information. I mean, you could say there was an inflection point when the web really came online. Information became democratized. Now, information synthesis has become democratized. You can go into one of the reasoning models and within a couple of sentences prompt a 20-page research report on the state of the market vis-a-vis the exact stage of your company, analyze every single competitor for a particular product category, and tell you which one to buy. Now, I think that goes back to a little bit of Uncanny Valley, which is we do have fundamental mistrust of that a little bit. I think we tend to impart an agenda to anything we see. I know I do. And what is going to happen? It's one of the fundamental internet rules, not the one you're thinking of, but the other one that says that if it exists, somebody's going to try to market and sell it. So the
Sure.
logical next thing that's going to happen, of course, and it's already happening with AI search, is people are thinking how to influence AI search results with product placement, is exactly that is going to happen, is there is going to be influence wielded. I mean, look at OpenAI. They are so hopelessly in the red that it's almost inconceivable how that company even continues to exist. But you and I can likely throw a dart and land in the bullseye that says that they commercialize this thing by opening up a window into the ultimate consumer and shaping and or influencing based on answers provided? How long until OpenAI transforms into something akin to Google with sponsored answers? My guess is not very long.
I would assume that. So either that, or of course, as we've seen a million times before in tech, another company will come along that's built on the foundations that they laid, which will monetize off the rip, and they'll relegate OpenAI, worthless. Essentially, they'll fold or be acquired, and then Grok or whatever comes next, right, is going to come forward and say, hey, we're already ahead of this curve. Our models are far more advanced. We have more computing space. We've already got more infrastructure, and it's going to be $25 a month for any user right off the bat, and then they'll take over. So it could be one of many ways. I think OpenAI was the first of its kind. But again, since when does that mean much of anything anymore in today's day and age? And I mean, it is kind of one of those things where I think there's plenty of competition. I mean, you've got Grok that's coming up really quickly. You've got Llama, you've got Claude, you've got all these other cognitive models that are theoretically even further advanced in terms of reasoning in certain areas. If we're looking at MCP servers and things like that, what their capabilities are, they're rapidly catching up. And then we also see how quickly and how easily it is to completely disrupt this market, even if it's short term. When you look at something like DeepSeek, nobody even really understood what DeepSeek was or what its capabilities were. But because, it'd been built on legacy technology and was capable of doing the same things with far less compute, all of a sudden the entire world, who doesn't understand any of this still, oh my God, it's over. OpenAI is dead. DeepSeek is taking over. This whole AI thing is going to crash because, there's a whole net new technology that's going to spring up to gobble it up. And of course, 2 weeks later, when enough industry experts have a chance to voice an opinion, everyone realizes that it actually really was just a blip on the radar, and we resume status quo. So it's a wild time. It's a wild time to be in the industry. And I think the trends are going to be so hard to keep up. I mean, to me now, trends in AI and AI capabilities is like trying to keep up with Trump's executive orders. It's impossible.
It's nearly impossible. It's a whirlwind, but I do think you hit on one of the imperatives. And if we're to write the list of what we need to do as humans in the space, and this one's a little ironic, but we do need to actually master the tech and have an opinion and a viewpoint and understand which ones to use and when and how. And I think that's one of our critical imperatives is the landscape is too crowded. So one of the human elements, I believe, right now is actually understanding exactly that. What can I automate well and is not going to cause that uncanny valley effect? Is anyone using AI SDR well right now? I don't think so. So is that something? Yeah, I don't think so. I actually don't think it's one of the stronger areas to leverage. Is anyone?
I'm not sure. That's one of the things that I might argue against, because I'm not sure how many companies are using real SDRs particularly well, if we're being frank.
Well, good, extremely good point, but here's the counterpoint. And this goes to a separate bullet, but it's a critical one. The stats don't lie on this, especially in enterprise deals. Outbound generated opportunities are higher ASPs and you have a higher win rate. Now, look at that compared to the predominant narrative right now of AI SDR, AI everything. I actually don't believe that you can open with any sort of reliability or predictability, which is what we have to predicate everything on, of course, in SaaS, is we can never be happy with today. It's always, if I do one, it needs to be a model for doing 20. And if I do 20, how do I scale that exponentially and build a system that will teach another 100 people how to replicate my model that I created 20 for myself? So we always have to think 2 and 3 steps ahead in terms of creating the factory. Even though we may be under a million in revenue, we always have to have the factory mentality at hand.
Well, that's a couple of the scary points of where something like this trend happens to be going. I mean, I've always been a firm believer in, building talent from within, first and foremost. So many companies have abandoned the idea of I hire an SDR, I train an SDR, I graduate the top 5% of my SDR class into account executive roles. I move those account executives up to regional sales managers role. Like too often I see companies just fighting this, tooth and nail, which is SDRs are SDRs. You use them up until they burn up. You churn them, and you keep that pool, just constantly in rotation. And AEs, companies seem to be hiring more and more from, outside of the organization and then trying to retrain into their product model. There is no progression for that if you're primarily using something like an AI SDR. You can't promote an AI SDR to an AI AE,
Who
right?
says?
Well, sure, I guess theoretically you could, but I don't see very many people doing that in general with a lot of these AI products, which is the scariest thing, which is they're not training models, right? They're not training models off their data. They're not continuously driving net new discovery and net new training into those models. A lot of those models are not particularly sophisticated enough to even do that. Half of these SDR companies or AI SDR companies and a lot of AI marketing companies in general are really just building wrappers around something like GPT, which is not designed to be in a continuous learning model. And they're not predicating their future success based on, existing data on what works, what doesn't work to a large degree. Like there's a big gap there between, hey, I can build you 25 SDRs that are automated and they're just going to, go out and look at market trends and then generate some random messaging and they're going to blast it out to, 5,000 people every single day. And they can answer, basic questions when people respond. That's a far different cry than bringing in an agency to actually collate all of your existing data and look at everything that's worked in the past and everything that's working presently and where you're trying to take an organization in the future and start building models that are constantly training on real-time data. Like, I don't think people really understand how complicated that actually is to do and what type of, horsepower it takes to actually be able to do that.
And the irony, of course, is that you need humans to train AI models right now.
I mean, people constantly seem to forget that you need
exactly
in the loop. And again, I think where this is going to see the biggest rise, where it's already seeing the biggest rise, which is really kind of this giant agentic wave, which is we want to continue to push down the rabbit hole of how many redundant and, manual data entry tasks I can automate out of my organization as quickly as humanly possible. And there we're seeing a ton of rapid growth. And that's where we're seeing this move away from, traditional robotic process automation, in tools like UiPath and Automation Anywhere.
Replacing BPO. I think Agentic is the next wave of BPO. I really well and truly do. But let's pause on that topic because I think you brought up a couple of ultra interesting points going back to the topic at hand, which is what can humans do right now? This is something I've been thinking about a lot of late. And you're right. The basic premise of AI is generally scaling and replicating something known. There's still a huge amount of blue ocean in that right now. The limits of the capabilities of robotic process automation, or even companies willing and of enough scale to take on a BPO process, there's still a lot of wide open territory for AI to come in and plug and play into the manual repetitive task. Now, what can the human do? Humans can innovate and synthesize in creative, unforeseen ways. And I think that's an inherent limitation. Now, I'm not enough of an AI engineer to well and truly understand the difference between a really sophisticated LLM and machine learning / neural network. But what I don't necessarily believe is that an AI can replicate the unexpected innovation that a human can come up with, which is why humans are present. We pivot, we change, we adapt, we create. And I think that for me is the crux of how humans remain valuable in the AI world, is we're in the cockpit controlling the orchestration, even controlling the orchestration of Agentic for those things that are well suited to those processes. And we know what tools to use and we know what to leverage. And what we're effectively doing is being the operator, as it were, of a lot of different orchestrated processes, some of which rely on our own human ability And this crosses over into what I think the next real topic is: what resonates for humans? And I think this is going to increase in importance. So, if we're talking about the next bullets, and this is a little bit of a hard one to hear because I think we don't like it as humans. We like to think we're infinitely adaptable. What I do think is going to become increasingly important is real expertise. And this is that leveraging of true experts in the underlying field learning how to become salespeople. I think this is one of the trends that's going to happen is sales as its own specialized domain. You and I, we have our 10,000 hours plus, 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 plus. We're experts in sales. Both of us have had an affinity for process automation for a really, really long time. For me, I think that's the fundamental value proposition of software itself is process automation. So I've always gravitated to that.
Software only exists to make people's lives easier. It's an entire market that's built on personal satisfaction in terms of eliminating unnecessary, unwanted, and unenjoyable tasks. Right. That's why we create software. Right. I don't want to do this anymore. There's got to be a better way of doing this. How do I do this better? Right. Yes. That is the definition of every software ever created since the dawn of software.
Well, those that are valuable.
Right. Sure. There's no doubt about that. I mean, obviously there's a whole pleasure side of the industry and that serves an entirely different purpose, but all intent and purpose for in the business world, software has always been about driving efficiency. So it makes sense for a lot of people to kind of pivot towards, process automation and business process optimization, because at the end of the day, who can wake up in the morning and say, hey, I can't wait to read, these 100 emails and then look at these 17 spreadsheets and calculate all these differences and build all these reports. Nobody wants to do that. That's busy work, right? Those are all the things that we need to do in order to lead to a decision of importance. Or we're building all of our substantiated educational points to make an educated decision towards moving something forward, generally speaking, when we're looking at all of these types of repetitive tasks. And then there's the flip side of it, which is, hey, these are all the things that need to get done in order for my business to just operate. I've got to process invoices. I've got to balance books. I've got to, onboard net new customers. There's a million different things that you have to do that are just core data entry tasks, really, at the end of the day. Right. It's just a matter of moving numbers from one server to another server at its core. So there's that. And I think, again, there's tons of room for AI to kind of play in those spaces. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of what's coming become very, very good at understanding where those opportunities lie. And there's lots of companies that are kind of doing that now, but I still think they've been kind of limited in their success in terms of how good they really are at looking at an enterprise and identifying all of the main points of weakness where there can be improvement.
Another one that I really want to talk about. So what existed as a parallel to RPA was process discovery. And this may very well exist. Again, I may not have gone deep enough to actually understand it, but I do think there's a lot of room for AI to determine what AI can do. So AI process
going to be a big one. I mean, you've got big companies like Celonis that have been doing this for many, many years. But if you talk to anybody who's ever used Celonis, they'll generally tell you that it's almost impossible to actually implement. It's incredibly difficult. It usually requires bringing on multiple consultants and experts.
Disruptors.
And everybody and their brother is going to tell you that they haven't, right? UiPath is already touting agentic tools for process discovery and all these sorts of things, right?
Every AI company is now calling themselves agentic. Is it real or not?
Well, that's a whole other problem. What actually is AI? What's real AI? What's robotic process automation? There's like 17 different topics that we could spin off probably entire podcasts around. But I do actually want to go backwards, because we were going into an interesting space of where do humans operate? Where are our affinities? Or what are our strengths versus, where AI is particularly strong or particularly weak? And I think, the short answer to that question is that humans live, breathe, and realistically thrive in gray space. We're incredibly good at taking unknowns on both sides of the equation and coming to some middle ground where we think there's a logical decision to be made and picking a path to move forward. We're very good at kind of reading between the lines and trusting instinct to a certain degree based on expertise and time and service to make an educated decision. And I think now some of the most interesting challenges that are being solved in the AI sphere are focused solely around that. It's seed divination. It's how do I make a reasoning engine that models the way that a real human thinks and decides on how to do things and what to do and what to use, right, in terms of tools in order to accomplish that. And then has systems of checks and balances, like a reward-based system, just like humans operate off of. Look at
Mhm.
the outcomes of the decisions that it's made and determine, was that a
Yep.
good decision or was that a bad decision? And should I make that same decision again? And if not, what is my corrective action to get to the desired outcome? And
Yep.
then being able to store and re-access that as core memories down the road. That is what humans do. We compile millions and millions and millions and millions of data points every single day. Everything we see, touch, hear, taste, smell, every conversation we have, somewhere in the back of this processor that no one's been able to replicate so far, that data is there.
Oh, there's an old philosophical concept that, let's not go too far down the rabbit hole on this one, but this is it goes to communications theory, and this one can get a little contentious, but there's a, I don't even know what to call it. Maybe it's an axiom. I don't even know. But whatever it is, it basically says there's no such thing as personality. And you stop and you say, of course there is. I have a personality. But what it's getting at is it's saying that no, there is no fixed definition of how you're going to respond to stimulus. Because the way the human brain is architected and built, we are constantly evolving with every single bit of information we take.
Everything is situational. Everything.
Everything. And I think that AI can't really do that well yet. It can reason through
At
things,
scale
but
yet. So like
you know,
that's what I think all the most interesting projects are focused around that. And
yep.
if you really want to start talking about, hey, like when does the machine, evolution or revolution like really and truly enter, like we never thought we'd get to, is when a lot of these projects that are being worked on now by all the major, AI firms out there and a lot of smaller independents that are, there's a lot of mathematicians that are being drawn very, very quickly into the world of AI. And they are trying to break down, at the transistor level, which is an interesting term that they've adopted for, some of the different types of decisioning trees within an AI model. At that level of how does a human personality form? How do I replicate that? And then how do I make decisions based off of a model? And that model is a top performer. So in theory, you would look at, your organization and take your top 5 and build incredibly complex decisioning models and reasoning models around everything they do. Every conversation, every keystroke, every mouse track, every sales call, every business meeting, it's analyzing every email that they write. And then it has to figure out, how do I build a personality that models this individual and how they think? So like, how do I build John 2.0? Historically speaking, I have an excellent track record of making, decisions on the fly during important meetings or
That's
conversations
based on
that
a
lead to
data
positive
set.
results.
That's
It's a data set, right?
impossible to replicate. And that's why corporations employ individuals with diverse experiences. But let's extrapolate that, because I was thinking about that one this morning. What I think the inflection point or the revolution is going to come when AI autonomously learns from experience and can teach other agents what it's doing. So for example, let's talk about an agentic SDR workflow. This SDR workflow analyzes responses and autonomously, instead of a rule-based statistical average answer that is given to something, situationally can actually train another agent and say, hey, actually, you know what? These people said no after you said Y in response to Z. That's actually not good enough. We need a different response next time. Hey, agents, deprecate this workflow, go to this one. I think that's going to prompt something. Now, I haven't read prompt, as it were, but that I haven't seen yet. I'm sure it's being worked on. But
It definitely is. It's definitely being worked on. But I think, as with all things, like it will take some time
we're
to
not
get there.
there.
But the real
Go ahead.
question is what do you hope to achieve at the end of that
Exactly.
particular
We're
work,
going to
right?
Wally. Is that what
Are,
we're doing?
are you trying to entirely replace people operating in that position, or are you looking for the most effective way to replicate the top performers within your organization so that you can do more with less. I think that's
Yes.
primarily what people should be targeting. And I think that is what a lot of people are targeting. And again, like I think the conversation is broad, whether it's limited in scope to how this affects kind of sales and SaaS sales versus how this affects entire organizations. But I think, if we're going to focus more on kind of the sales aspect of this, I think the name of the game here is replicating top performers, right? And giving the ability to rapidly train and reflect and mirror those types of behaviors across the rest of your sales organization to drag your average up, right? You want to pull your average up
now
in terms of performance. And I think one of the interesting things there is, even if you had that, if you had all the tools, if you had even an AI prompt that could run live on your sales calls for your everyday average Joe and prompt them information on what to say or how to combat objectives or, on the fly, I don't think people realize how few individuals even have the capacity to be able to intake information like that on the fly and regurgitate it in a way that's natural and become, the ultimate AI augmented sales guy. Like, it's not as easy as it sounds. Reading off of script is not what creates, incredibly adept and successful salespeople. And it doesn't build relationships. Like, at the end of the day, the flow of a conversation has so much to do with whether or not people walk away from that feeling like they just got info dumped on, or if you just read them a bunch of canned answers to some of their most common questions, or whether or not you actually built a bond with them, that you related to them on some deeper level and built a level of trust and provided that information all at the same time. Like, that is what makes great salespeople great. And that's why I think it's almost impossible to kind of fully replicate them anymore at this point, because it's not just about always having the answer at the time. It's knowing how to steer a conversation. Like, I don't think AI has any conceptual understanding of kind of how to steer a conversation at this point, or even have the capability to be able to react quickly enough on the fly to, a very agile conversation. It's very different than saying, hey, I can build a very successful AI agent that can handle 90% of my call center flow. Because what happens when you call a technical service line? Hey, I have this service. I'm having this problem with this service, or I want to add to this service, or I want to cancel this service. There's black and white talk tracks that move through that process to get to the desired outcome that either the customer has or the client has. It's totally different than, net new sales. There's so much nuance there. And that's why ultimately I think, people still want to buy from people. So, like, again, we keep bringing this all the way back full circle to, like, what can AI do? What can AI not do? Where should it be? Where shouldn't it be? And where are people relevant? I still think at the end of the day, for most products, right, especially in SaaS sales, especially that are going to touch, multiple aspects of someone's business and be transformative if they're a good product to one or more departments, man, like, I don't think people just want the rudimentary answers to their questions of how they directly apply to solving a problem. They want that relationship, man. They want to know that if everything goes south, they're not going to pick up the phone and wind up talking to a bot. They're not going to, send a text message and get answered by a bot. I mean, my most cherished relationships in sales, whether it's enterprise or mid-market, have largely been driven by people that know that at the end of the day, I'm always here and I have their back. And if they need something, or if they're just concerned about something, if they want to know if they even should be concerned about something, for example, they know that they can get a hold of me and I will walk through that with them real time, and not just a B black and white answer. Right. No, it's like, hey man, like, I hear you. Like, I understand. Like, you sound like you're legitimately worried here. Like, what's going on? Like, that's a human conversation. And people still want human conversations when they're talking about, vesting themselves into people, products, or things that directly impact their daily lives and their career trajectories in many cases. Because who wants to make a software purchase that potentially goes south? This could happen with a real person, of course, as well. But who wants to be the guy on the hook for saying, hey, well, I bought from an automated service offering and I interacted with, their sales flow, which is largely, AI driven or bot driven. And It was BS. It didn't work. The implementation wasn't
Yeah.
successful.
So
We just spent $150,000 on a 12-month, agreement to this software, and it was all nonsense because an AI just fed me all the answers that I wanted to hear exactly the way that I wanted to hear them, and it seemed convincing, and the demo looked great, and I bought. Now the real question is, how is that any different than a shy sales guy who's ultimately trying to do the same thing? That's going to be the counter argument to that as
but
well.
that differentiator is sales has to transcend exactly that and provide more than the AI. And I think that's exactly it. And that's the question. And that's a good point to end on, that we all have to ask ourselves at every single interaction with a prospect. There's an old axiom. I definitely said it to you at various points. Your prospects, when you're engaging with them, should be willing to cut you a check every time you interact with them. We're now past that because you could be willing to cut a check to an AI. It could provide something valuable. Your prospects and you have to be able to answer that question now. Could a robot have done this for me? And if the answer is yes, well, then you're not providing enough. And this is a brand new hurdle that we have to cross. But I think this is the one imperative that says, how do I stay relevant in this world where the robots are coming online and they are highly valuable? Well, number one is I need to be the operator of the robots, and I actually need to understand how to orchestrate them and where to orchestrate them and how to operate them. But more importantly is I need to understand where they are not most effective. And I need to actually be more valuable than a robot in every single interaction I have, because that's still actually valuable enough that it's going to move the needle and do what the crux of sales is, which is not to influence or change. It's to guide and solution and proffer a path forward where potentially there was none or someone had indecision. And we're going to synthesize the information based on our knowledge base and our DB. And there's an inherent, almost intangible element, which is, to your point, I will actually trust a human that's doing these things for me. I have the willingness to trust a human. And I don't know that the willingness to trust a bot there exists. For me, it's one simple factor. It is, I think, I feel a constraint of algorithm driven answers. You can reach the end of them. And with a human, a good human that you trust, there is no end. There's immediate information synthesis, or there's implied trust that says, okay, you have the ability to go learn and then synthesize for me, but I trust the core you. That
Well,
doesn't
there's
exist for
also
robots yet.
there's certainly a huge thing to consider in the fact that algorithms get it wrong all the time. If they didn't, everyone would be a multi-million-dollar day trader with,
Exactly.
trading
Where
robots,
should I
right?
put
Because they're
$10,000
just always right all the time
right
because they
now?
have all the data, right? Like
Right.
they're not, right? And I mean, we've also seen the inverse side of algorithmic, behavioral influences. If you look at things like social media, algorithms can be malignant. They can be a cancer. They can be the opposite of what you're hoping for them to be as well, because computers don't think the same way that we do. I still think that there's a whole misconception that all these algorithms and everything else under the sun is operating similarly to the way that humans make decisions. That's what they're trying to figure out right now. How do humans make decisions?
Not understood yet.
Right now, we don't really understand truly how machines think. We don't. We're creating it on the fly as we progress this technology. That's changing day by day. So I guess the reality is like, how much do you trust an algorithm? Because an algorithm's sole purpose exists to just look at averages and try to be on the side of an average, of a trend, of whatever it is that it's been pointing at. It's just trying to find the best course forward to achieve its particular goal, which is to be, as successful as it can be in one given aspect or another.
As the kids say, what does that result in? They're mid most of the time. They are, and deliberately so.
It's very, very true. I mean, I think, of course, it's going to change. But I think, yes, there's going to be a ton of inherent mistrust, I think, and blindly following, AI curves in any field of business for anything at all whatsoever. I mean, they make mistakes. We're still solving for hallucinations. There's still a lot of general unknowns. You can't just blindly trust, any AI agent to do the job their way if it has anything to do with variables. The more variables you throw into the mix, the more and more difficult it becomes to create an AI model that will operate the same way successfully every single time, which is why you have all these, separate overflow workflows for, anomalies. And in many instances where it hits a decision tree where it's like, man, this doesn't fit this bucket or this bucket. I don't know what to do with this. Put it down in this bucket. Which bucket is that? It's the human bucket. Hey, man, I don't know what to do with this. This doesn't fit the model. You look at this, and most of the time, that's where we become the AI. We can look at that in 5 seconds and say, oh, well, clearly somebody misentered this number here and this number here. Simple mistake. We can rectify that in 20 seconds and then pass it back into the workflow. But that's still common. That's the majority of AI interaction, which is I only understand this much and how to operate within these 2 lines. If I fall outside of these 2 lines, I don't know what to do. Right. And without a ton of guardrails, in place, there's no telling what a bot might do in that situation if you gave it free rein.
You can find this easily, which is that even when not trained to do so, there's a million studies on this. The bots eventually converge in starting nuclear war and becoming racist, and nobody's yet cracked this why. They do, and who knows is the answer.
It's a scary conversation to have when you really start looking at why large scale or open source AIs tend to trend immediately towards, singular directions that are generally not
bad. They're bad, right?
Which would reflect that the majority of humans are, probably in that same category, which I'd hate to admit or really dive into too deeply there. But I think, there's a lot of interesting takeaways here, and there's a lot of things that I think that are worth following up on. I mean, I think would love to look at the impacts that some of this is having, both from a sales perspective, from a hiring perspective, a training perspective. There's a lot of different things that are happening right now that are having real world impacts at scale that I don't see too many people talking about, which are all AI driven, especially when it comes to probably a hot topic today, which is hiring. How do I find the right people? How do I hire the right people? And on the flip side of that equation, how do I find a job and how do I become a qualified candidate in an AI driven world where every single individual's resume is now custom tailored specifically to a job description, which was simultaneously probably generated by an AI model in and of itself, which is now screening applications with an AI model in an applicant tracking system. It's unprecedented. I mean, there's a lot of real world examples that are playing out before our eyes as we speak that I think a lot of people aren't really paying attention to, that are probably going to have some pretty big impacts across the technology landscape, good and bad. And I think that's a couple of good things that I'd love to talk about a little bit more in depth if people are interested in continuing to hear two knuckleheads ramble on about their current thoughts on where this is all heading. But I do think a lot of people are having these conversations. I do think a lot of people probably aren't being fully honest in their opinions, which I love to express here. Because I think, if there's anything that has implicit value anymore these days that's exquisitely human, is our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. It's the one thing that AI doesn't have. And I think it's the one thing that we shouldn't lose sight of. And I think it's one of the things that I'm most fearful of in an AI revolution, is that we move further and further and further away from humanity as a whole and what makes us human, and where we should apply those things, both good and bad, in terms of our logic and our own reasoning engines and our own emotional capacity to make decisions, and whether or not sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad. I think a lot of people would love to remove emotions from decision-making trees, but I don't know if that's entirely possible, and I'm not entirely sure that that's even a good thing to.
I don't think it is. I think that variability is ultimately what makes us human. And on one side, you have the late stage capitalism approach to this that says that the Wall-E idea is actually what we want. Is that what we want? Fully autonomous companies selling things to each other? I don't.
Well, the scary thing about that is I've joked about this many, many times, but isn't that already kind of what's happening? All of technology, for the most part, is just this fictitious kind of man-made world where we've created millions of widgets to sell from one company to another company to drive more convenience and more efficiency or more pleasure, this, that, and the other. It is essentially the economy that we've created. We're not really producing hard goods anymore. We've created a bunch of digital widgets that we're selling from one company to the next to drive an endless economy. So, I mean, in a sense, Wall-E is already essentially where we're at in the 21st century in modern day tech. It's who can create the next widget that people find interesting or that has implied value to roll out across another widget to make that widget a better widget. It's in effect, that is kind of largely what we're doing. But we're doing that in order to create an economy, to create jobs, to pay people money so that they can live and consume, material goods.
Now, but now add on the complexity of taking away the underlying economy when you replace the humans in that system with bots, and now you have bots existing for their own purpose to sell bots to bot-driven companies. It starts to get a little mind-boggling.
I think that's when you really start getting into like science fiction, one guy. So then you end up with a world of like 100 Jeff Bezoses who just have like a bot army that create bot products that with no employees. And you want to talk about massive like transfer of wealth and just like the complete elimination of the lower and middle class. I mean, that's the dystopian future, which is automate everything. Bots think of the ideas, they create the products, they code the products, they deploy the products, they sell the products.
Yeah, and then what do we do, which is beyond the scope of today's
That's right.
But we're not far off from this becoming a question we actually have to answer. I think we're much closer than we were 6 months ago. Because at the rate of evolution of these things, Moore's law is in the dust. Moore's law no longer exists anymore because we're beyond hardware constraints and now we're talking about algorithmic capability. So, and we're scaling exponentially at this point. All right, we need to stop talking about this stuff before we talk for another 8 hours.
I'm sure a lot of people are having similar thought processes and probably streams of consciousness, whether or not they're having these conversations out loud or recording them like the insane people that we are and every other person who puts themselves in front of a camera and spews their inner thoughts. But I hope it's enjoyable. I hope there's some value to be taken away from it. And I think in the future we can narrow the scope a little bit, but I also never want to discourage either one of us, I think, from going down the rabbit hole, because I think those are the most interesting conversations. You may come in with one specific topic in mind, but I think where it ultimately goes via natural dialogue is maybe more interesting.
Yeah, what are we doing right now? We're being human. And I think if there's anything that makes me sad about the modern state of the world and AI, it's that we could be losing a bit of this cerebral human element, which is the ability to do what we've touched on a couple of times today, which is analyze and make a new plan and go forward and come up with something entirely original. And I really think that remains the role of the human. A bot can't do that right now. And for me, that's my guiding principle. And that's what I'm going forward on is if a bot could have done what I just did, well, then I didn't actually add enough value. And that's how I'm defining that statement that has driven me crazy for my entire career, which is just add value.
Yeah.
And that phrase has become much more clear to me in recent times, which is I did something a bot couldn't have done. And I think that that's our endpoint for today is that's what we have to think about, and that's what we have to govern ourselves with.
I like it. I agree. And quite frankly, I have very little interest in living in a world where, human interactivity falls off the face of a cliff and we all end up just living in boxes and not going outside and touching grass, as the kids like to say. Yeah. or having real conversations with real people and building working relationships with folks that can last years and years and years. Professional relationships, personal relationships. I think all the value in life is derived out of the relationships that we seek and that we build and that we keep. And as soon as that becomes a thing of the past, then we might as well just be robots ourselves.